Broadcasting from occupied territories or the flea media, it's the Reality Dysfunction Podcast. A space where a diverse group of brown folk from across the nation explore the political experiences and social future of our Chicano Latino community. Control the narrative. Resist the dysfunction.
Okay, so let's take it away, right? So welcome once again to the Reality Dysfunction Podcast. Today, we'll continue to explore the importance of ethnic studies, and our focus today will be on the fight for Puerto Rican, Latinx, and queer studies. So who of our Reality Dysfunction co-hosts do we have in here right now?
Dr. Ernesto Morales. It's good to be here. I'm super excited about this conversation.
I'm Alex Lozada, and I'm coming to you from the East Coast, and I'm very excited to be here talking with all of us today.
So our invited guest is Lawrence Lafontaine-Stokes, Professor of American Culture, Romance, Languages and Literatures, and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Larry, as he preferred, was born and raised in my wonderful San Juan, Puerto Rico, and received his BA from Harvard in '91 and his MA and Ph.D. from Columbia in 1999. So before I continue, Larry, do you want to say hello and hola to everybody here?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to the Reality Dysfunction Podcast. I'm really excited to talk to all of you.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome. So Larry is the author of Queer Ricans, Cultures and Sexualities in the Diaspora, 2009. He's also the co-editor of Keywords for Latina, Latino Studies with Deborah Vargas and Nancy Raquel Mirabal out of New York University Press in 2017, as well as several other books of fiction, and there it is. His most recent book, Translocas, The Politics of Puerto Rican Drag and Trans Performance, out of the University of Michigan Press this year, 2021, is part of the Triangulations, Lesbian, Gay, Queer Theater Drama Performance Series. Larry performs in drag as Lola von Miramar since 2010 and has appeared in several episodes of the YouTube series Cooking with Drag Queens. Larry's research areas of interest include Latin American, Caribbean, and U.S. Latina literature and culture, theater and performance studies, queer, lesbian, women and gender studies, and gay studies, and he's the former director of the Latino Studies program at the University of Michigan. And very important to mention, his grandmother is originally from Mayaguez, Puerto Rico, out of the West Coast. Today, we have Larry here to discuss with us why Latinx, Latino, Latina, Puerto Rican, and Chicano studies, as well as queer and LGBTQ studies, are key to U.S. culture and society. His futuros proyectos as an author and an artist, and have a brief conversation on his upcoming appointment in July 2021 as the chair of the Department of American Culture at University of Michigan. So Larry, I'm going to ask the first question. Why are Latinx, Latino, Latina, Puerto Rican, and Chicano studies key to U.S. culture and society? And we've had this conversation, but we want to hear what you have to say.
Wow, that is a big question. And I don't know if I can answer all of it, but I can tell you why I study Latina, Latino, Latinx studies and why I teach it. It has to do with a very important population in the United States. Almost, is it 60 million people? Yeah. It has to do with my own personal history. As you mentioned, I am from Puerto Rico. And in fact, it's interesting because at first I really thought of myself as a person who did Puerto Rican studies and Latin American studies, but we live in a moment of profound transformation. I suppose you can say that moment of profound transformation has been going on for at least 150 years. But at least since the 1970s, there's been great demand in American universities for students. Students want to understand Students want people to understand what is the history of Latinx people in the United States, what are the roots of Latinx oppression, like why are we in the situation that we are. And in my specific case, as a gay Puerto Rican who writes about queer culture, so I'm really interested in the intersections or the particularities of LGBTQ Latinx experience, and that is what I write about. That is what I frequently talk about. And because sometimes those communities don't talk to each other, or sometimes those social movements in the United States, like the gay and lesbian movement in the United States, historically was very racist. It excluded people of color in the 1960s and 70s. There were very big major tensions. And then at the same time, Puerto Rican activists, Chicana and Chicano activists were very resistant to queer people. There was lots of anti-gay and lesbian bias in Latina and Latino communities, not always, but in some very specific cases. So I really see my work as bridging the sphere of gender and sexuality and issues of race and ethnicity in a progressive agenda in the United States.
Wow. I mean, I think that's really exciting. I was telling Juan Carlos, you know, as we were kind of having a conversation about this, that for myself, you know, as a Chicano studies scholar, one of the things that I've really been doing a lot is reading, you know, queer theory, and just how relevant I think it is to I mean, much more so than all the a whole bunch of other ideas that are coming out. I mean, like the whole, a lot of the stuff that's being written, you know, one of my favorite authors, somebody that I really go to a lot, is Jack Haberstam. And, you know, I use that book, the Queer Art of Failure, a lot. And I teach this class in Man and Masculinity. I think that, and I'm still thinking through a lot of these things, you know how it is. It just kind of like marinates in your brain. You know, when everybody talks about toxic masculinity, you know, and obviously rightfully so, it's a discussion that has to be had. But I think that the real answers for a lot of that lie in queer theory is a way of really challenging. Like I think it might be the only way to challenge toxic masculinity that we have right now in our arsenal.
But I think the interesting thing, so I agree that the work of Jack Halberstam is really useful and important, but there have been queer Latinos since the 1960s, people like John Recchi, like precisely trying to make that argument. Yeah. That there were toxic masculinities in the Mexican American community. Yeah. And I think that the big difference is that in the 1960s, people were very resistant. Yeah. They did not want to have that conversation. And it's the same thing in the 1970s and early 80s with people like Cherie Moraga, Gloria Ansaldúa. The publication of This Bridge Called My Back in 1981 is a major intervention in what we consider queer studies. Yeah. Some people don't think of it as queer studies, but I do. It really comes from a position of challenging patriarchy, homophobia, lesbophobia, seeing coalitional politics, not only between Chicanas and Puerto Ricanas, but also with Asian American women, Jewish women, Black women, Native American women. Yeah. So in the 1990s, when the field of queer studies became very visible and consolidated, there was a resistance to acknowledge that people of color had been doing that. That James Baldwin was doing that in the 1960s, that Gloria Ansaldúa was doing that in the early 1980s, that John Recchi, Cherie Moraga, Manuel Ramos Otero, Luz Maria Umpierre. So part of it is not only integrating queer theory and trans theory, it's also rewriting that history, because that history has whitewashed its origins. And, you know, some people trace origins to Michel Foucault and to Freud, and that's amazing. And Foucault has brought so much. but so did James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And so did Sylvia Rivera, a Puerto Rican trans activist at Stonewall, who was very active in the early 70s. So that's, I think, that I'm more excited about that. Or I guess maybe like putting people in conversation, say like what happens when you read Jack Halberstam side by side or together with Sylvia Rivera or with John Recchi. Like for some people that might explode their brains.
No, I think that's great. Yeah.
Recchi that's the way it should be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. I think it is the way it should be. Yeah. That's exciting.
Yeah. I was gonna say, and it's also important, like you were saying, like it's rewriting of that history. And it's like, who are the storytellers? And I think that's a very common theme that we talk about on here, and is how are we elevating those voices? You know, you are now in front of a classroom teaching these courses. Todd is in front of the classroom teaching these courses, writing, selling your own works. And being on this podcast, I think, is really important to being able to tell the stories from our own perspectives, not from an outsider perspective.
Alex, I agree. And it's really interesting because it happens in very unexpected places. So for example, it happens in the introduction to Latino studies class. For example, when you start to teach Juno Diaz. So my experience as a first year professor straight out of graduate school was teaching Drown, and having a student come into the classroom in the late 1990s, very, very upset, because he did not know why we had to read. Well, he was upset because Juno Diaz talks about male sexuality among men who are having sex with men. In fact, I mean, that title story, Drown, is precisely about the anxiety, the homophobia, the tension. So these two guys have an intimate relationship, but then they realize that really goes against like what they have been taught about Latino masculinity. And then the protagonist says, you know what? I don't want to talk to you anymore. I don't know who you are. Like, get out of my life. And nobody understands what happens. And what happens is toxic masculinity, right? So I didn't do a pre-reading activity. I forgot to tell the students, oh, by the way, we are going to discuss Juno Diaz. He is a male Dominican-American author. And in this short story, there is a discussion about homophobia and the tensions. And so I guess I do try to set up arguments so that people don't face that anxiety, but it still happens. It happens. And I mean, I think that's what we're here for. That's what we can do in the classroom, not only in the classroom, but as catalyzers, as people who have that knowledge and expertise. And that is what makes it exciting and relevant and very important.
Yeah, I don't know if you read, there was an article maybe about a month ago in the New York Times about that one professor. I think he's at Princeton and he teaches within their classical languages department. Did you read about him? He's Dominican.
I think that is Daniel Padilla.
Yes, Padilla, that's him. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating to read even him talking from this perspective as this, Black Dominican immigrant man, right, teaching within the classics, and even the whitewashing that he has seen and is seeing, and how that is kind of fueling a lot of this kind of white supremacy and things that he sees within the insurrection that happened, and how that is like in popular culture and the whitewashing of our classics. It was fascinating. They also have it like I listened to the story, so it's really
and in that case, it's really about transforming our sense of what classics can do and what it is. So first of all, it's about recognizing a history of racism and exclusion in the field of classics, but also saying that when you come to classics, to the teaching or scholarship on ancient Greeks and Romans, that you can do that as a person of color, and that you can ask very interesting questions as a person of color that can really transform the field. So that in fact, a field that many people think is boring, irrelevant, like why do we have to learn what happened in Athens in the 4th century before the Christian era? Well, Daniel Padilla and other people say, actually, well, it's the basis of democracy. It's very relevant. All fields should be open to democratizing gestures, to the integration of people of color in the faculty ranks.
And also he was saying that, there is a lot of like man-to-man intimacy as well, but we don't really talk about that. But it exists even, in those texts. And then we should be recognizing all of it, not just, the whitewashing, but also the hetero whitewashing, the hetero washing, or however, of all of it as well.
Or just the elimination of the intimacy, right? I mean, the fact that men aren't intimate with each other, it is just, it's ludicrous, and, absolutely. The taking away of that, I think, is also, it goes a long ways towards, dehumanizing men, right? And really making us seem, I think, in sometimes ways that we're not, like that we're all predatory, and that we're all, it's just about sex, or it's this or that, or, that you can't, tell your friend that you love him, because if you do that, there's something shocking about that, or to hug them or whatever. These are all, I think I totally feel that, especially, well, I know that isn't necessarily but the whitewashing of these subjects, right? And who's fit to teach them, and I think that it, coming at it from like a faculty perspective, can also see too how it's just this sort of like de facto glass ceiling, right? Like if you're Black or Latino, you can't teach classics, right? Like, and so then it's just another way of keeping us, just within this one framework of, what's happening in the academy. Whereas, and then the academy is that simultaneously saying, well, this isn't real education. Like Chicano studies, that's not real college, that's just something that people do.
Electives.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's not just for men and masculinity. It's also for women.
Yes.
And femininity and the relationships between women. So Gloria Anzaldúa has a really good essay from the early 90s. It's called "To Queer the Writer, Loca, Escritora y Chicana." And she talks about how she wasn't that really into the word lesbian, which is a classical word from the Greek island of Lesbos, from the Greek poet Sappho. So Gloria Anzaldúa says, for her, lesbian was a term that really circulated among white middle-class women. So in that essay, Anzaldúa says, I think of myself as loca. Loca, a crazy woman. That loca is the term that responds to my community. First of all, it's in Spanish. It's a word that circulated in the border, in Texas, in the Valley. I am not a lesbian. I am a loca. And loca for me is a very exciting word because, of course, it is used against women who are not normative, who are free in their sexuality, or who are sex workers. But loca is also a term that is used against or by effeminate men. So it's not only crazy woman, it is also like faggot, which is a strong word. These are complex words, but that's kind of like, so those the bridging between women's resistance and men's resistance is something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
I literally want to kick Alex and Todd out of the conversation because I want to ask you all the questions and have you to myself, but I'm not going to be selfish like that. I am a gay queer man, right? So these same intersections for me have been present all the time, right? And as you mentioned, the word loca, has been present in my life for, when I started coming out after within 4, I came out of the closet in the States. So, but within 3 years, That was the word. I call loca, loquita, loki, with my Puerto Rican. Yeah, just the variety of how I call my gay male friends and even lesbian friends. Mira loca, and it's the same thing. And it goes beyond the woman that may be crazy, right? But I think it's a perfect opportunity for me to then ask you about your most recent publication, Translocas, the politics of Puerto Rican drag and trans performance. So within that context of locas and also understanding that trans is a different terminology, so how can we, mix all this information as you're, saying it? So tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah. So I also came out, so to speak, in the United States after leaving Puerto Rico. So we are what Manolo Estavillo refers to as sexiles. And I don't think I kind of knew that for me, like staying in Puerto Rico as a teenager, as a college student, was going to be complicated. And so I think it was one of the motivations to come study in the United States. And interestingly enough, so I came out in English. So, the word gay was kind of the word that really circulated a lot. And then in the 1990s, when I moved to New York City, I met the writer Angel Lozada. And Angel Lozada was really into loca. And I just remember I found it very disconcerting. I was like, I found it confusing because, well, it can be a stigmatized term. But Angel Lozada was all about it. And in fact, his second novel, No Quiero Quedarme Sola y Vacía, the protagonist is called Loca. She goes out with another Loca in Washington, D.C. And I was like, and then the clincher in 2009, the drag queen Nina Flowers appeared on the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race. And then her catchphrase was the word loca. So then it really went, it's not just a word that Puerto Rican queers are using. I mean, it's a word that's circulating on transnational television. So in the early 2000s, I was really interested in writing about queer Puerto Rican performers who use drag, people like Javier Cardona, Eduardo Alegría, Freddy Mercado, Arthur Avilés. And then it was kind of just like playing around with terms. So they do drag sometimes, not always. In Spanish, we say transformismo and travestis. Those are some of the words that are used. And I knew that I wanted to write about the specificity of Spanish and how Puerto Ricans move back and forth from Spanish to English, and how certain words in English like gay or homosexual or even queer, they're useful, but they don't really represent the complexity of that living in between languages and in between geographies. So it was really a playful metaphor. And I thought I was very clever making up this new term, translocas. And then it turns out some other people had also made it up. And in fact, Lionel Cantu, who was a Chicano scholar in California, who unfortunately died very young, but who wrote a very important book about the sexuality of migration. So he was studying Mexican male queer migration to the United States, and he wasn't even able to publish his book because he died as an assistant professor. And Salvador Vidal Ortiz and Cantu's advisor published his book. So that word was circulating, and it was embraced by a feminist group of scholars, which was mostly women, but also included Lionel. And they published the anthology Translocalities, Translocalidades. And they also talk about considering themselves translocas because they do feminist work in translation across borders in the Americas. So I'm really interested in the anxiety that the word loca creates for feminists and for queer people and queer scholars, but also translocas as a space of possibility. So the book just came out. I mean, I've been writing and publishing about it for a really long time, but the book just came out, so I don't know what the reception is going to be. People might say, nice try, but let's move on to another term. But it's interesting because, so for example, queer Chicanas and Chicanos have been recuperating joto, jota, and joteria. That's really interesting because in Puerto Rico, if you say joteria, people just don't know what you're talking about. It's not a word we use. So there's lots of regional variation. That in Puerto Rico, maricón, pato, pata, loca. Those are terms that we use, and that's why I have written about them. I have published about them, and every time I talk about them, I have to explain. Please don't go around using these words. I mean, you have to be very careful. It's not about getting everybody to repeat the word, but it really is about getting people to understand that we're not all gay or queer in the same way.
So it's kind of grabbing our own terminologies, right? Retaking our terminologies, finding other definitions, and understanding all the different definitions across. And it's kind of the same thing for queer theory. When we talk about queer theory and queer studies, queer was like a bad word. Oh, you're queer. Oh, that's so queer. So those are like regaining that. So, and, beyond mentioning something on that, I also would like, Larry, if you can speak to our communities and our listeners in simple terms, what the definition of what are queer studies and LGBTQ studies, just to make sure we're all on the same boat here.
Yeah, Juan Carlos, that's a good question. So, for example, my first book was called Queer Ricans. Queer Ricans, and people it generated mixed reactions. So some people are like, what is that? And some other people are like, why are you using that word? So part of what happens is that queer in the early 1990s became a very useful term for people to signal that they were doing gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender studies, but that they were doing it in a different way. That they wanted to move away from strict identity categories or from identity politics, that it was not just simply about, oh, I'm gay, and now I am going to talk or I'm going to tell you what gay is about, but that it was really about challenging notions of gender and sexuality in society, that it was really about destabilizing our understanding of gender and sexuality, and to mark that division. So you have activist groups like Queer Nation, to highlight ambiguity, to highlight tensions, to kind of like not reify categories, like to acknowledge the risks of identity politics. Identity politics can be useful and strategic and necessary, but they can also put us in boxes. So I think queer theory, right, was trying to challenge that, and it was just a label that stuck. And for me personally, queer theory really comes out of women of color feminism. Some people acknowledge that genealogy, some people do not. But then the issue, so queer theory arrives, it becomes very popular, but so much so that it is commodified. The word queer starts to appear on television. For some people, it totally loses its stigma. So queer eye for the straight guy. Meanwhile, you have older people who have been so affected by the word that they still find it offensive. So a funny story I like to tell is meeting the writer Larry Kramer, a very important gay author. And I went up to him and I was like, Mr. Kramer, your name is Larry. And my name is Larry. And I teach queer studies at the University of Michigan. And here, innocent, I'm expecting him to say, that's fantastic. And instead he turns around and he says, I hate that word. So those are reactions that we have to anticipate that might happen. And I anticipated, we do complex, controversial work. So there are people who do not like the word queer, do not like the word loca. In fact, some of the artists I write about have real resistance to these labels. And in Latin America, in Spanish, well, queer doesn't really exist. It's a word in English. So some people have said, well, how do you say it in Spanish? Do we just adopt the word in English, which is one option? And we do that. But there's also been an effort to change the spelling. So instead of writing it Queer, like what happens when you transform queer and make it into a Latinx or Latin American Spanish language concept by spelling it Cuir. So that's a really interesting tension. And then there's people like the feminist philosopher Sayak Valencia from Mexico, who, she talks about from queer, Queer, to queer, Cur. What happens when you put those two spellings, or it's the same pronunciation, but it's kind of acknowledging that we're not, in Spanish, in Latin America, in communities of color, we're not LGBTQIA in the same way necessarily than mainstream white Anglo-American middle-class society.
We're not. That's why there's Latinx pride.
And that's why there's Reality Dysfunction podcast.
Yeah,
exactly.
This is really interesting. I mean, seriously, it's I know that for myself, that I would say that my intellectual journey really began with that book, This Bridge Called My Back, and with Third World U.S. feminism, and Ansel Dua. But I mean, honestly, I've always been a Moraga fan. To be, I mean, really. And her essay, Queer Aslan, and I think it was from her book, The Last Generation. I mean, that essay really had a profound impact on me, and the people that I was working with at the time. And it just really, I mean, it really made me see things in a very different way. I mean, I grew up what I think would be considered very normal, and the whole, very cis, very hetero, and just didn't even consider until I got to a certain point any of these other perspectives. But yeah, the impact, especially I would say really from Moraga. I know that a lot of people are really, especially in the Chicano community, they feel very impacted by Gloria Anzaldúa, and I recognize that and respect it and honor it, but I've always been a Moraga fan, and those initial writings were they blew me away back in the early 90s.
Well, Cherie Moraga is a crucial figure. First of all, she's still alive. She's still writing. She's still talking. She's still annoying people. And she's a very complex thinker. She has rightly been taken to task by people like Francisco Galarte in his new book, Brown Transfigurations, because Moraga has not been open to trans Chicanos, like Frank Galarte, for example. But Moraga's essay, Queer Aslan, is really crucial. And I think that part of what happens is that writers like Moraga and Anzaldúa write mostly in English, so that makes it easier to circulate in the United States. And I think a lot of the queer thinking by Puerto Rican authors was happening in Spanish. And then what happens is that maybe they get read in Puerto Rico, but sometimes not even there. And frequently they do not get read in the United States. So people like Manuel Ramos Otero or Luz Maria Umpierre, or people like Juanita Ramos, which is the pen name of Juanita Diaz Coto, a professor at SUNY Binghamton who co-edited Compañeras Latina Lesbians. So I think my goal as an activist scholar, as a teacher, as a writer, has been to raise awareness so that it's not just about John Recchi and Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa and Ernesto Martinez, as fabulous, and Rigoberto Gonzalez, as fabulous as they are. It's also about people from Puerto Rico, people from Cuba, people from Central America, like Maya Chinchilla, who are doing really interesting work on Central American queer studies or queer culture. So I think that there's like a real need for this conversation to continue and to keep growing.
These are transnational issues, right? And with migration, a constant, it goes between back and forth, and that's the importance of not just the countries but the diasporas as well. So tell me, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say so transnational and translational in the sense that part of our work is a lot about translating. So we'll translate, sometimes we translate even when we speak English to English, because our Englishes are so different and our local contexts are so different. So translating from Chicanx to New Yorican to Cuban American to Dominican American. So sometimes we don't even understand each other when we're talking the same language. But a lot of this also happens. So for example, major Latin American queer thinkers like Nestor Perlonger, who wrote absolutely brilliant work in Argentina and Brazil, and in the 1980s and 90s, and was only translated 2 years ago. So most people in English were not reading Nestor Perlonger, even though Nestor Perlonger was a crucial person for thinking Latin American queer studies. So this happens a lot. So I totally agree that translation is really crucial.
You know, and I want us to have a reality dysfunction conversation on just terms, like where you come from, what do we call XYZ, right? So I think it's super important to understand just that rainbow of opportunities and terminologies and definitions that it has by region within a country. So, you know, with that important, and I think of the term Miramar as a barrio of San Juan. So who is Lola von Miramar and why is she important for your work? Why is it important for Latinx communities and studies?
So that is funny. So wait a sec. So I don't really know where you all are from. So I know Juan Carlos, I know that you're from Puerto Rico, but Alex, where are you from?
So my background is Colombian. I was born in New York, raised in Michigan. I've lived in Boston. I've lived in Miami.
Oh.
So a little bit of everywhere, right? And now I'm back in New York, and I live in Brooklyn, and I work in Manhattan, and I work at a college in Manhattan.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Todd, you're Chicano?
I am. And I have a whole bunch of other questions that I want to ask you. I keep looking at the clock and I'm thinking to myself,
okay. So
we might have to bring you back for round two. I'm from Michigan. I was born there and I was raised there. I lived there pretty much all my life until I moved here to Prescott, Arizona, where I teach Chicano studies and community organizing at Prescott College.
Wow. So okay. So I am Larry LaFontaine, and I am from San Juan, Puerto Rico. But in fact, I am from a neighborhood called Miramar. So Miramar is a neighborhood in Santurce. It's near Condado. It's not that far from Old San Juan. It's a very central neighborhood. It was an amazing place to grow up because, it was close. It was close to many things. There was lots of community life. I walked to my school, and it's also a very pretentious neighborhood. It's also, Puerto Rico is a very class stratified society. So Miramar is also a very come mierda. Miramar is also can be very elite. I mean, I was a scholarship student. My mom had to teach. My mom worked in a library in exchange for my tuition and the tuition of my sister. So our class position, Miramar, people think it's all wealthy people, and that's just not true, because there's lots of middle class people and middle class people that really range from precarious middle class to well-established middle class. So in the early 2000s, I created a blog, and then people would playfully call me Lola because my name is Larry. So I said, well, I am Lola from Miramar. Lola von Miramar, which is an homage to a German artist, Rosa von Braunheim. And so that was just like a name that I was using. And in 2010, Fausto Fernos, a drag performer, a performance artist in Chicago, said, Larry, get a wig, get a dress, and please get to Chicago because we want to record a cooking video with you for a series we're starting as part of the Feast of Fun podcast. So Fausto Fernos and his husband, Mark Felian, started a series, a podcast, Feast of Fun, Gay Fun Show in the early 2000s. And in 2010, they said, let's extend this, turn it into a drag queen cooking show. And that's sort of where I started to perform in drag. I was writing about drag, about Puerto Rican drag mostly, but I had never been interested in performing in drag myself. I thought there's other people who are very talented. They do it very well. I'm quite happy being an audience member. I appreciate drag performance, but Fausto and Mark thought it would be hilarious for me to dress in drag and for us to record a video called Cooking with Drag Queens, How to Make Tostones. So that was our first video. Or patacones in Colombia, or twice fried, crispy green plantains. And that started a very long collaboration. So we've made videos on how to make arroz con pollo, or rice with chicken, cooking with drag queens. We've recorded a video how to make coquito. So Juan Carlos, I don't know if you make coquito at the Christmas.
I don't. I just drink it. Gotta have a lot of rum.
And they've invited a lot of other queens, like Black, Latina, Asian American, white queens. So they have over 40 episodes in that series. But so Lola von Miramar started online on YouTube. And you know what happens when you do that is that everybody wants to meet you in person. And then I had to explain that I don't know how to do my own makeup. I don't really have any kind of training. And they're like, learn, figure it out. So for the last 10 years, I've been appearing and performing in person and online as Lola von Miramar.
Which I just followed on Twitter. So I don't know if you're very active. But I just followed you on Twitter.
I just found the link for that particular segment, how to make tostones. So
it's pretty funny because you know we're all about like you know making them tasty, but then the crisis in the video is that there's no tostonera, there's no tostones press. So then Saltina Obama Bouvier, which is the drag queen played by Fausto Fernos, says, we can just use cha-cha heels. And she picks up her shoes from the ground and we smash the tostones away. So it's probably not very hygienic, but it was delicious.
That's all right. A little bit of dirt never hurt anything in the way anything tasted. I tried to make tostones for my 14-year-old a little while ago, but I realized that it's more complicated than I imagined that it was. Yes. So, because mine turned out not very tasty.
Oh, well,
so I'm gonna watch this video.
Yeah. So you soak the green plantains in salted water.
Did not know that.
And then you fry them twice. You have to be careful. You don't want to be throwing water into hot oil. But then you season them with adobo, with garlic, salt. In Puerto Rico, we eat them a lot with like mashed garlic with olive oil. Oh, yeah. So your tostones should be very crispy, salty, and flavorful. It should have some garlic. Garlic is essential. If you don't like garlic, it's okay.
I love garlic.
Love garlic.
Yeah, bring it on. I don't think there can be too much garlic. Actually,
I can't stop laughing.
No, I really messed that one up. I bought the plantain and I just sliced them up, man, and mashed them down with a fork and threw them in the fire.
Maybe they were too ripe. It sounds like they were more like maduros or amarillos.
Yeah, I'm gonna watch this video and then I'm gonna try it again. Because I told Leona, I was like, these are so good. Like, I love tostones, you know. And then when we had them, she just looked at me like, what is wrong with you? It was just like, and I told her, I said, I messed them up, man. I was like, this isn't
so the plantain has to be green. It has to be very firm, very hard.
And you gotta fry it before you mash it.
See, it's fried twice. So you cut very thick slices. You fry those. So maybe you have a plantain, and then let's say you cut it into 6 or 7 pieces at the most, and then you deep fry those, and then you take them out. You can soak them in salt water, and then you smash it, or you press it down, not with a fork. You need like a plate or a tostones press.
I have a tortilla press. I'll use that.
Tortilla. Yeah. And then like now you have this like more like pancake sort of thing, and then you fry it a second time, and that's when it gets really crispy. So it's crispy because it has been deep fried twice. That it also has to be. It cannot be a ripe plantain. It has to be a green plantain.
Okay. All right.
So you're very healthy.
Hey.
Deep fried twice.
I mean, if you got to deep fry it twice, you got to deep fry it twice, right? There's no. I mean, don't fight it. Just go with it.
That would be a great title, right? Cooking tostones with your tortilla press.
Reality dysfunction tostones.
Being Latino in the U.S. That's what that means. Right?
Dysfunctioning your reality with adobo and drag queens.
Exactly.
Oh, I think the problem, Todd, is that you weren't dressed in drag when you tried.
Well, I'll tell you what, I will do that the next time that we make tostones, and because my 14-year-old is definitely,
there you go.
She really wants me to let her put makeup on me and dress me up. So I don't know if we're gonna find a dress around here that fits me, but we can make something happen.
Me and my friends used to use sábanas, the bed sheets, and just make some kind of outfit with that. And you look pretty. Don't worry about it.
I'll put a little brooch right
You
here.
can put a towel, like the women after they get out of the shower. You put the towel, and then you definitely look kind of draggish.
So thrift stores are a really good. I can't believe we're having a conversation about how to perform in drag. But so I write about drag. And I encourage everyone to do drag. You go to the thrift store or to dress for less. You don't want to spend a lot of money.
Sure.
Some drag queens spend thousands of dollars. Yeah. And I think that's really important to recognize. For some people, this really is their career. It is a business. It is a type of employment. For other people, it's really just much more about fun or even about exploring gender. I think RuPaul's Drag Race has been a really interesting space for Latina queens, for Latina performers. There's been over 20 Puerto Rican performers or contestants in the 13 seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race. But there's also been Chicanas, like Valentina. Valentina became very, very popular. There's been this season, there was a Dominican American contestant from the Bronx. So drag can be fun. But in my book, I say that drag can also be political. Drag can be about raising awareness. Drag can be about challenging orthodoxies. Drag is not just funny. Drag can be about questioning racism. So, for example, I look at the work of Javier Cardona and his performance You Don't Look Like, and his use of blackface and wigs and images in drag. I look at Freddy Mercado's work and how Freddy really invites us to think what is human, what is non-human, what is a non-human animal, like what is alive, what is dead, like what is a monster, like how do we even challenge our conceptions of what humans are? So drag is so many things. The drag is also about making tostones. So yeah, I hope that your listeners, the listeners of the Reality Dysfunction podcast, can see our Cooking with Drag Queens series.
Yes. And I think the key for drag queens, and I love drag, there's a restaurant here in New York, and I want to say it's called Lips. It's right around Midtown.
Yes.
And they have nightly shows. And I love going, I'm in the neighborhood, I go to grab a drink when it's allowed, when it was allowed, right? And it was fascinating to see the outfits and the hair. And I'm like, I want to be that. I'm like, I'm a woman, right? I identify as a woman. And I just can't rock that look, I can't, the shoes. And so I think for me, the key is the shoes.
Oh.
Like never do I see a drag queen in some flats. It is un tacón that is like, how do you walk in that? I want to do that.
That's amazing.
But I think for me, like,
yeah, and I think the other important thing to remember is that some drag performers are cisgender people, so they identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. But some, and in fact, a lot of them are also trans people. So performing in drag can be a space for transgender persons. So I write about Silvia Rivera, who was a trans activist, but I also write about people like Lady Kateria at Escuelita, which was a major queer Latinx space in New York City, and about Barbara Herr. So Barbara Herr, who's on Facebook, like she talking about the pandemic in New York City. So she has been, out of work, so to speak, for almost a year. And now that the bars are reopening, and she's a transgender performer, she has a whole theater piece called Transmission about what it means to be a Puerto Rican transgender woman born and raised in the Bronx who went through gender correction surgery in New York City. So those are some of the things that I write about in my book, Translocas.
Yeah, and here in New York, right before the pandemic, but really now too, there's been a lot of the drag queen story hour. And so they would take...
What's Drag Queen Story Hour?
So they would basically have story hour like they do at the libraries, but the person reading, the presenter, would be in drag, full drag.
Is this on YouTube?
It is on YouTube, but so in my schools, I know they
program. It's a web page everywhere. There's a page.
So they would have like drag queens go into the elementaries, right, for elementary age students. They would take them into, and then students would then go to the libraries, and you would go to. And I know in the pandemic, they started doing it, I think it was on Zooms with some schools and some libraries. They were offering it. And I'm like, it was great. And I was able to attend like one or two Zooms where they had them at the libraries, and I loved it. It's fascinating. They're performers they're able to just come to life like on the screen, and you feel engaged, and I loved it. It was really great.
And it's also about allowing children to also enjoy drag performance in an age-appropriate context. So most people associate drag with adult entertainment, and that is clearly where it has developed and thrived. But there's nothing wrong about having a drag queen go read a story for kids. First of all, because kids love dress up. Yeah. In fact, kids are much more open and interested and can be much more transgressive. Adults are the real problem in our society.
Got it.
So I think it's about challenging and transforming all of that.
That is completely correct. We are running out of time. And as a librarian, I want to say that Drag Queen Story Hour is the best program that you can take your kid to, because it's not only funny, it's a regular book reading in a library safe space, and you will have a way of showing your kids how to express themselves in a way that you probably can't teach at home. So I strongly recommend queer drag queen story hours are usually, you can just check in your public library and the programs go there. So as we're running out of time, unfortunately, we're going to have to call you, Larry, again to call back, right? I want to thank you really for this wonderful and enlightening conversation for all of us and all our listeners. I think it's been an important conversation to host. And I thank my awesome co-hosts, including those that didn't speak at the end, like Reiner. Hi, Reiner. And, we look forward to continue future conversations with you and other LGBTQ Latinx activists to showcase realities and histories of our communities in the U.S. and the diaspora. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to, as we begin to celebrate an upcoming Summer Pride Months and events. So Reality Dysfunction, thank you. Follow us on Facebook. And I know there's something else I have to say, but I don't remember what it is.
Is it fuck Latinos for Trump?
Yeah, fuck Latinos for Trump.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Juan Carlos. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Rainer. It's been a real pleasure to be on Reality Dysfunction podcast. I really appreciate the invitation. And if you're interested in my book, Translocas, you can get it with a 30% discount using the discount code UMS21 at the University of Michigan podcast. So I think that's much better than buying it. You can buy it on Amazon, but if you buy it at the University of Michigan Press website, it has 30% off.
I just bought it full price. Well, that's okay. That's all right.
Well, thanks, but yeah, there's a flyer on the website. If you look at the flyer, it has the discount code UMS21.
All right.
This is the Reality Dysfunction.